doing a fine balancing act. If you've heard the opening statements and also what the Chinese president and Russian president had to say at the BRICS Business Forum, where the Russian president spoke about how he'll be setting up more retail chains in India, and he spoke about how oil exports have increased to India and China. The Chinese president lashed out on sanctions. Today, Putin has spoken about how, for the current economic crisis the world over, there are certain quote unquote selfish countries in the West that are responsible because of the poor decisions that they took. So, we have that backdrop of the Ukraine Russia crisis continuing as the talks happened, and there's a mention of Russia Ukraine talks, the need for direct talks between Russia and Ukraine in the Beijing Declaration as well. Do you see India doing a fine balancing act amidst all of this?
Thank you, Munmun, for having me on your program. I think India is now the fastest growing economy around the world among major economies, and definitely the fastest growing economy within these nations. Second, as Prime Minister also highlighted in his speech, India is emerging as a major destination, particularly for digital economy, and he gave a figure of $1.5 trillion potentially. That kind of space India now provides for international investors. And of course, the balancing act that you mentioned. India is the only BRICS country which is also a member of Quad and other US-led initiatives, the most recent being the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, and of course also equally engaged with the Russia, China, India strategic triangle, or the BRICS summit which is taking place. So in that sense, the balancing act of India is extremely significant. So just like in Tokyo Quad Summit, I think India was responsible for ensuring that the final statement had no mention of Ukraine, which is what United States had initially wanted. United States had come there thinking of Quad nations unilaterally, unanimously denouncing Russia, which did not happen thanks to the balancing act of India. Similarly, in BRICS nations summit also, you notice in the speeches only Chinese President Xi Jinping mentioned Ukraine, where he talks about how this focus on expansion of military alliances, ensuring safety at cost of other nations, etc., indirectly, in that sense, blaming West for what is happening in Ukraine. But India's presence made him speak very differently compared to his unilateral initial preceding speeches, for example, to the BRICS Economic Business Forum or BRICS Economic Summit. So that kind of presence of India, I think, makes both the US-led initiatives and China-Russia-led initiatives would not really push for brinkmanship and create far more tensions. And I think another very interesting point to see here is how Ukraine crisis has actually highlighted the kind of critical role that BRICS can play. And you heard the President Putin mentioning clearly how during the first 3 months of this year, whereas Russia has been subject to severe and unbearable sanctions from the United States and its allies, its trade with BRICS nations has gone up by 38%, as he mentioned, and the oil exports in month of May have gone up by 11%. So BRICS positioning itself maybe not as an alternative, but as a kind of a balancing grouping is significant and is becoming visible. And in that BRICS playing the balancing act, India's critical role of a balancer is really becoming increasingly visible, because it is making sure that neither United States on one side nor Russia, China on the other side push towards brinkmanship and confrontation, and sanity and dialogue continues to be the way of ensuring global governance. I think of all the major speeches, and that is my last point for this intervention, of all the 5 speeches that you heard, I think Indian Prime Minister's speech was far more focused on specifics compared to other speeches being either led by their own national national drive to push across their position, or simply criticizing the best. Indian position was very specific in detailing where BRICS can specifically move forward.
Right.
And in that sense, the fact that countries like Russia, Brazil, South Africa, they are facing internal economic crisis, China's economic deceleration. In that sense, with all the limitations, I think BRICS, if you are pragmatic in using what benchmarks we use in measuring success and failure. I think BRICS is clearly inching towards far more pragmatic initiative, far more technocratic focus, rather than
Right.
hype and geopolitics. I think that is the difference that BRICS makes.